Good evening, everyone. I'd like to open the meeting. Can I have a roll call, please?
Mr. Accomando?
Present.
Mrs. Borelli?
Present.
Mr. Cipollone?
Present.
Mrs. Mahoney? Here. Mrs. Robinson?
Here.
Mr. Quinn?
Here.
Mr. White?
Here.
Mr. Winnie?
Present.
Mrs. Zottarelli?
Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Adequate notice of this meeting has been sent to all members of the Board of Education and to the Bergen Record in accordance with the provisions of the Open Public Meetings Act. At this time, please be advised that all cell phones and electronic devices are to be turned off. I have to check myself. Okay, so we'll start with Superintendent's report.
Good evening, everybody. I would first like to start by thanking the community. I'm sure those of you who live in the community voted yes for the second question on the ballot. So I just would like to thank all of you who voted and the public who voted to support our second question for security. We're very excited, and we've actually been in communication already with the company who provided us the quote and the bid for the work, and we're very excited to get our buildings into the most secure position we possibly can. So thank you for that. I'd also like to congratulate Stephen Quinn, Mariana Ianello, Michelle Roloff for earning seats on the Board of Education. And I wanted to, it's hard work, terribly underpaid. And I wanted to give special thanks to Mr. Winnie and Mr. Cipollone for your service to the school community. I'm very grateful. So I will save the rest of my report for Wednesday night, and we will also hear from the students about what's going on in the buildings.
Okay, you're going to do your report later, so we have a presentation now for our board attorney on HIB training.
Okay, so, can everybody hear me? Or you want me to use the microphone? Yeah? All right.
Yeah, let's do that. And the board could go sit in the audience.
I don't know how to get this to stop. Good? Okay. It's mood lighting, because we're going to talk about HIB. It's very important stuff, actually. So we're going to go over harassment, intimidation, and bullying, which is a law in New Jersey that applies to all public schools, charter schools, and now also applies to some private schools in certain situations. As we go through it, I generally don't read off the slides, so if it's not up there and I'm not reading it, don't worry about it. We'll either get to it eventually, or it's something that I am sort of skipping over in the interest of time. But this will be available for the public should you like to have a little reading material at night when you can't sleep one night. If you have any questions as we go, please just make sure to ask me. You don't need to wait until the end. As it pops into your head, raise your hand. Let's talk about it if you have a question. We'll just get started then. Okay, so HIB, as we refer to it, is harassment, intimidation, and bullying, and is a New Jersey state law that says that any gesture, written, verbal, or physical act, or electronic communication, whether that is a single incident or a series of incidents, that is reasonably perceived to be motivated by a distinguishing characteristic, and these are examples of what distinguishing characteristics are, but they're not exhaustive. And that takes place on school property or at a school-sponsored event, and that substantially disrupts or interferes with the orderly operation of schools, and that a reasonable person should have known under the circumstances, not, again, the person necessarily who is the alleged victim, but a reasonable person should have known under the circumstances that it would have the effect of demeaning or causing fear in another person, fear of harm to themselves or damage to their property, that it could insult or demean another person or a group of people, and that it could create a hostile work environment, hostile educational environment for those students that were personally spoken to, touched, bullied, or anyone within the vicinity of hearing it. So for those of you in the employment section, sometimes you hear about workplace harassment. This law is very much similar to that, in that it's about how the alleged victim felt, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the person that it was addressed directly to. So for example, if somebody told an off-color joke, let's say in the workplace as an adult, okay? And that off-color joke was told to a woman who sits in a cubicle next to you. You heard the joke. You found it to be very offensive. The law would say that could be harassment. Even though the joke wasn't directed at you, you overheard it, and a reasonable person would have found that to be insulting or demeaning. The same thing applies in the school setting for students. It doesn't necessarily have to be the alleged victim or the person that the comment was directed towards. A group of other students could have heard it and felt demeaned, okay? So some things under other distinguishing characteristics that are important to know are, the list is becoming bigger and bigger as the case law expands in this area. So here's some examples of what courts have found to be distinguishing characteristics. So as you can see, it's getting bigger and bigger. So it used to be people thought race, gender, sexual orientation, the big ones that we think of as adults in the workplace. And now they're expanding greater to be really anything that separates a child from the masses. So, examples are new kid in town, weight, hair color. There was a case about 6 months ago that was about being a vegan. A student was made fun of for being a vegan. That was considered a distinguishing characteristic. So I think the lesson here is don't focus on what you think might be the distinguishing characteristic. Focus on whether or not it acts to separate that student from the rest of their peers for something other than conflict, which is what we'll get to in a minute. Okay, so we said that any of these things, right, a series of physical touching, aggression, or verbal, making fun of somebody, that could happen on school property. We also said off school grounds. So it could be something, and this happens more and more, that is electronic. So for example, someone sends a rude text message to a peer. Typically, and they do it from home, they send it from their cell phone at home. We find out about it in the schools, and typically we can only take action if that conduct, if the sending of the text message spills over into the school day. So Timmy gets sent a text message on Saturday from Johnny. Timmy's very upset. Timmy's parents finally pull out of him why he's so upset over the weekend. And they come to us. They come to Miss Shanley and they say, he was sent this awful text message that claimed he was a homosexual. And it's spreading across all of the rest of his peers. They're all sending each other pictures now. And he's really getting very upset. He doesn't want to come to school. That, him not wanting to come to school, substantially interferes with his right to learn. Because of the conduct, the text messages, even though they were off school ground, they are now substantially interfering with his right to an education. So that would be an example of a HIB that occurred off of school grounds. Some other examples have been Facebook. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of examples of, I was going to say PlayStation, but I think that ages me, right? What is it now, Xbox? Yes, Xbox. Oh, they still, PS4, sorry, yes. So the kids can talk to each other on these games now, and they are mean. I have a 15-year-old who I think is sent from heaven, honestly, but he can be a jerk to his best friends while they're playing these video games, and they can send messages to each other via, like, I guess, the remotes on the games, but they can also verbally say things to each other through their headsets. So all of those things obviously are off school grounds. But if they say something, if they start a pattern of behavior against a particular peer and that spreads over into the school day, that is something that we have to address as a school. Whether or not we see that as conflict, we'll get to in a minute, but it is something that we are required by law to address because it impacts them here, if it impacts them here. Okay, so what is a HIB? Not every negative interaction between children is bullying. Okay, conflict is a regular, everyday part of life, as I know all of us are aware of, right? There is a lot of case law now, and part of what the law did in July was change to address the difference between conflict and HIB, and how school districts are able to deal internally with deciding whether it's a HIB or a conflict. So, the student's intentions are not controlling. Just like I gave you the example of the workplace, it doesn't matter that the person who told that off-color joke was only kidding. They didn't mean it to be offensive. That doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter in the school setting either. It doesn't matter that the alleged aggressor didn't mean to hurt anyone's feelings. What matters only under the law is how the alleged victim feels. Was it reasonable given that victim's standing? For example, so would a reasonable fifth grader feel the same way, basically? You're going to look at the ages of students a little bit differently depending on, first grade to high school, for example. This can include bullying by staff members, so that is something that parents are allowed to bring to our attention, and it is something that we do have to investigate under the law. So bullying can be indirect and direct. Here are just some examples. We've already actually gone over those, so I'm going to skip that for time. There are generally 4 types of bullying. We've also been over that. Cyberbullying is just what we talked about with the text messages and the Facebooks. So conflict, and we'll get to this later on, there might be a few cases in here if we have time, but in general, conflict, they look at it as if a group of peers have been, let's say they've been friends for years, and then something happens and they fall out from being friends. They're no longer friends anymore. And let's say Sally used to be in that group, and now Sally is being ostracized. She's not allowed to sit at lunch with her old group of friends. Maybe they even go so far as to, steal her lunch or push her in the hallway, tell her other people not to be friends with her. But you can see from the history that these kids used to be friends, and that this interaction, this negative interaction between her old friends and Sally can be directly linked back to their friendship. That, by law, has been seen to be a conflict and not a HIB. If you can find a reason outside of a distinguishing characteristic for conduct, that's generally going to be conflict, not a HIB. In that case, the kids weren't being mean to Sally because of a distinguishing characteristic. They were being mean to Sally because they used to be friends with her, and they had some type of argument, and they were no longer friends. And that is conflict. Yeah?
So, I hate to be the person who does this. So what about the imbalance of power situation where you have now, let's say, a group of girls, maybe this was the popular group, let's just say that. Mm-hmm. And now Sally is no longer a member of the popular group, and now this group basically has influence and power over her because now she can't sit where she wants to sit, she doesn't have the friends that she used to have, she really can't go to homecoming because she has, nobody to go with, to sit with. Essentially, they are, because of their position, ostracizing her.
It's a good question. The law doesn't right now see it in terms of a power imbalance for peers. There is no such thing as power imbalance in a peer relation right now under the law. There isn't. So even though the popular girls are not seen to have more power than an unpopular girl, according to case law right now. So the example I gave you with the girl, that's actually from a case. It's almost exactly that same fact pattern. They were really good friends in middle school. They got to high school. I think she dropped out of cheerleading or something, and the rest continued, and they kind of tortured her for freshman and sophomore year. Her parents brought a bullying claim, and they appealed it all the way to the appellate division, and the court said, no, that's conflict. That's not bullying. So the power imbalance is really more about staff over students. Sometimes it can be about older.
I was going to say, what if it's like a hazing type thing, like the captain or the varsity players and how they're treating new freshmen or something like that?
Right, so the older students, there have been some cases where older students have been seen to have a balance of power, and maybe the captain one, like Jane Ellen was saying, if the captain had some actual authority over the rest of the teammates, like maybe they got to decide when practices were, or what to do as a team outing or something like that, you could find somewhere where they had power over the others. But generally, peers are considered at the same level. It can be a little different with special ed students. So depending on the nature of the student, the alleged victim, if their cognitive abilities are much lower than their peers, then the court will look at that in terms of balance in power. Okay. So conflict, it generally is dual-sided, meaning most of the time the peers are kind of getting back at each other, and they get into that sort of immature circle of, he called me a jerk, now I'm going to call him a jerk, he called me a jerk, now I'm going to call him a jerk, and then just doesn't end kind of thing, right, until they grow up a little bit more. Bullying is typically one-sided. Sometimes you'll have the child sort of try to defend themselves, but most of the time, because of that imbalance sometimes of position, it's generally one-sided. But that's not to say I don't want to confuse any of the board member or public. You don't have to have imbalance of power in order for there to be bullying. That doesn't have to be. That's just one of the things that we can look at. Okay, so you guys, your policy is available online. This is a link to that. So if you see this PowerPoint online, you can certainly get to the district's policy. There's also a reporting form for the public to use as well as staff. The anti-bullying coordinator is the person who is in charge in the district for enforcing HIB laws. They're in charge of making sure that everybody has the training that they are required by law to have. They oversee the building level anti-HIB coordinator specialists. And then they provide data and information to the board to help with investigations, to help form policies, to help implement curriculums within the buildings and the districts to ensure we address any issues with bullying if we have them. The anti-bullying specialists are by building. And they report the incidents in each building are reported to them, and they are the person who's in charge of investigating them within their building. I believe those are all of our guidance, right? Okay. And then here is actually a list of all those people. So again, this is available for the public if you'd like to have it in the PowerPoint. Here it is. So these are all the staff members by building who are in charge of investigating within their building. Okay, so generally the way that a HIB is reported is one of two ways. Either a staff member has seen something and they report it to administration, or a parent or a student reports it to administration. Typically, these timelines refer to staff reporting because we can control when and how they give us information. But the requirement for the investigation to be completed within 10 days applies to whether or not it's a parent or a staff member. So generally, on the day that a staff member sees a HIB, they are required by law to report the HIB. So if they see it, they have to report it that day. They don't get to wait a few days. They don't get to, go ahead.
Going back to, like, God forbid, there's a staff member involved with it.
Yes.
How does that work in terms of, like, you know, generally you reach out to the parents, or like, what do you do in that? You just give a letter to this staff member saying that, you know how like generally we have a process for giving people the, you know, with the information to the parents, we've initiated an investigation.
So you're asking, do you have to tell a staff member that an investigation's been initiated against them?
I'm assuming yes.
Yes.
Just give it to them directly, yes.
You do, and you should probably make sure that you reach out. Yeah, you should reach out. You should definitely reach out to Ms. Shanley if it involves the staff member so that she's aware of it to begin with. And then it does involve, we have to let them know that it's happening. We have to give them the right to have a union rep with them when we talk about it. There are some additional things that we have to put into place if it's a staff member. Do you have to call their parents? No, I don't think you do. And you shouldn't be contacting, you can tell the parent of the alleged victim, but you shouldn't be giving any names away until your investigation is completed. And then again, conferring with Ms. Shanley about how to address that if it's a staff member. Okay, so as you were saying, we're required to inform all of the parents and guardians of the students that an investigation has occurred, but we have to be mindful of the confidentiality rights of each one of those students. So we can't tell the parents, each individual parent, the names of the other students involved. And more than that, we can't tell them distinguishing characteristics of the other students. So we need to be mindful if, for example, the alleged victim has a disability and we are notifying the alleged bully's parents that this has happened, we shouldn't be telling them, hey, it's the one kid in the building who has Down syndrome, because obviously they'll be able to figure out who that person is. So we have to work very hard to protect the identity of all of the minors involved. And that applies even after we've made a decision. And it stays that way through a large part of an appeal process that we'll briefly go over this afternoon, or this evening. Okay, so day one, you file a report. This is the report that you can get online. This is the report that the staff members fill out. It's also, I'm assuming, the same report that the parents can fill out as well. Okay. So they fill out a report. By day two, we have to have started the investigation. By day three, a report should be sent to the building principal or the anti-bullying specialist from the staff member who witnessed the incident. So verbally, they have to report the day they see it, but the next day, they had to have submitted something in writing to us. And that's because when you write down something immediately, you're going to remember it more accurately. And that's just sort of a well-known fact. The longer you wait to write something down after it happened, the more likely you're going to misremember or forget things. So the law requires that if a staff member sees something, they have to report it verbally within 1 day and then in writing within 2. And of course, this doesn't apply to parents because we can't control that, and they may not have seen anything actually in writing to write down. Okay, so then you have 10 days after that report, so it's typically 12 days, to finish your investigation and report it to the CSA, which is the Chief School Administrator, which is obviously Ms. Shanley. And then she has to receive the written decision on that investigation by the 14th day. So it's a really tight timeline that our administrators have, and that's also part of the reason why the law changed, so that when we get an allegation of a HIB, the principals now have the opportunity to say, I don't think this is a HIB, I think this is a conflict. And they no longer have to investigate every single thing that has the word bully in it as a HIB. They have the professional discretion to say, I believe that is a conflict. They have to take every allegation as true, meaning if Sally's mom comes and tells Ms. Wonder that Sally is being picked on and they are stealing her lunch and it was a friend of hers from last year and they got into a fight over summer camp, Ms. Wonder has to believe all of that. She has to take all of that as true. But then even seeing all that is true, she can say that's a conflict between friends or past friends. It's not a HIB. She can investigate it as a conflict, and she should. We are still holding children responsible for their behavior. We are still trying to teach them the appropriate way to act with their peers and in society, and we are still enforcing a code of conduct. No matter what we talk about today under HIB, that is all still true. It's just that we wouldn't investigate them under HIB, okay? And then after Ms. Janley receives that report, she has to then advise the board members of that investigation and the outcome at the next board meeting following that final written decision, okay? We also tell the parents what our investigation found. We tell them the nature of the investigation, meaning, did we look at video footage? Did we interview 5 students? Did we interview 5 staff members? How did we investigate? We tell them whether or not we found a HIB. We tell them whether or not discipline was imposed, but we don't tell them specifically what that discipline was because we are not permitted by law to do so. And then we tell them what other services we might have provided. So a lot of times we provide counseling or social skills groups or some type of other additional services to students so that we can teach them how to stop acting this way and how to treat each other with respect. We don't just punish, we try to teach as we go. Note here that nowhere does this say we give parents a copy of the actual report, because we do not do that. We're not required to do that, and we don't do that. So what we do is we give them a summary, and that summary includes all this information, but we won't be handing over copies of witness statements, for example. We won't be giving them copies of footage, for example. That's not something that we're required to do under this law. I'm not saying it's not required at some point, but under this law, it's not. Okay. In addition to that, recall that we only give information about the particular student and their parent. We never give out information about another student to a different parent. We never give out information collectively to, like, let's say it was a group of students against another group of students. We would never tell even best friends' parents about the other student. Doesn't matter if they say, oh, it's okay. We don't do that. We're not going to turn that kind of information over. So we already talked about this, but even if it's determined not to be a HIB, if we investigate it as a HIB, they can still be disciplined under our code of conduct. So there's nothing that says if it's not a HIB, then no discipline is imposed, that you absolutely can still discipline them. We talked about this a little bit, so I'm going to skip that. Here is a chart that we put together to discuss the differences between the old law and the new law. Primarily, the difference is that because school districts were really just inundated with HIB investigation claims, a lot of districts had to hire separate administrators just to handle the investigations that were required in the short time frame that was required. Some parents file HIB claims every week. And under the old law, we were required to investigate pretty much all of them. Or at least it was unclear. At the very least, it was unclear if we had any discretion. So now the law has changed and we have that discretion. We are allowed to say from the outset, like I said, this is conflict, we're not going to investigate it as a HIB, okay? It also decided that parents have only 60 days to appeal a decision. As of July, they used to have unlimited amount of time, or at least it wasn't written in the law. So now, upon receipt of the final decision, parents only have 60 days to say to a board, I want to appeal that decision, okay? And there's a few other things in here that really are more specific to policy that I don't think we should go over. Some of it's has to do with private schools for students with disabilities, and now the HIB applies to them. Go ahead, Steve.
Is there any time limit set for how long it can be from the incident to when it's reported at this point?
Yeah.
Which would be?
Oh, you mean when it's initially reported, like if a parent says last year somebody was bullied? Is that what you're saying? No.
Okay, so they can still report it 2 years after the fact.
They can, so that's called, in the legal vernacular, that's a statute of limitations, and there's nothing there yet. The problem is with any investigation, especially with children, the longer you wait, the less likely we're going to be able to find out any valid information about what may or may not have happened. But no, technically there's not. Go ahead.
So one of the conversations we've had as an administrative team, and maybe you can guide us with this, is that you do the initial investigation, you do it very quickly, and you have a recommendation that this was HIB or this wasn't HIB, it was student conflict. And sometimes, and then it has to come to me, and then it has to go to the board. But we feel that, especially with younger children, it's difficult to really make them feel the weight of their behavior if you're disciplining them 35 days out. So, as far as, are we within our authority to institute the discipline, regardless of the decision, HIB or student conflict, before it gets to the board?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. It makes a lot of sense. I had a friend who used to say the punishment should fit the crime kind of thing.
Timeline.
And the time is part of that, yeah. So, absolutely, you are allowed to discipline them under your code of conduct while you are investigating under HIB, but just be mindful, you can't discipline them twice. So if you've already implemented some type of discipline for a violation of code of conduct, let's say it's 3 in-class or lunchtime suspensions, something like, I don't know what you would do at an elementary level, but something like that. You wouldn't then discipline them again if you found them to be an aggressor after the HIB.
But we don't have to wait for the board
No.
to take action to accept
No.
the report.
No,
Is that correct?
no. You don't have to wait for the board to under a code of conflict, or I mean a code of conduct. Under HIB you do, but not under a code of conduct, right? And it's pretty typical actually for older students who to get suspended and be removed from school pending the investigation, and then so they're already being disciplined prior to the HIB finding being brought down. That's okay, just as long as you don't do it twice. Okay. All right, so board members, your duties. Your duties are to hear the appeals. They call it a hearing, but it's not really a trial, right? Like, so it's in closed session, it's private because it has to do with students. The parents will come to us and say they want to appeal. Technically, we need to convene within 10 days, but we all know that's pretty difficult because it would require a special board meeting. So we ask that they come to the next board meeting, and most of the time that's fine. They are allowed to bring attorneys. They are allowed to know what evidence the board is going to be considering in respect to their appeal. They are, I see you, Sil. They are allowed to ask questions of our administration, so that means our administrators need to be there. So it's a little bit, it's a mini sort of due process hearing. They are allowed to sort of hear everything that we have to say about our investigation and then ask questions of it in whatever manner that may take. Typically, we like to limit the time, but we don't say for sure you only have 20 minutes or you only have 30 minutes. They are allowed as much time as they need in order to appeal, but we're not going to be in there for 5 hours kind of thing. Go ahead, Sil.
With that 10-day request,
Mhm.
and as you said, most of the time the parents are very willing to come either before or after a board meeting, which some days can be 15, 20 days after. Can that be held against us later on if they chose to take it a step further, say we were out of compliance?
It's not substantive, no. It's something that most boards do. And in fact, I'm in the appellate division right now in 3 cases, and they all 3 have that as one of the claims, is that we didn't meet within the 10 days. It's not really determinative of whether or not the child did or did not commit a HIB, which is really the ultimate question before a court. This is more of a procedural thing. We honestly all thought that they were going to change this in July, because no boards meet in 10 days. That just doesn't happen. We'd have to have a quorum. We'd have to have 5 of you say in 10 days, yeah, we can be here. It's almost impossible. Some boards do it by committee instead of full boards, so that's something that we could consider doing, changing policy to allow a committee to hear these hearings and then make recommendations for the full board to report on. If necessary, we could talk about that, but typically it's not something that they say, well, that impacts whether or not ultimately the student, committed a HIB or not.
60-day limit on the appeal?
Yeah.
Does that apply only to kids after July 1? Or
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So there could be one from 3 or 4 years ago that could be appealed?
That's a good question. Sure, I don't know how they would process that. I mean, we would hear them out, for sure, but I think that would be a hard case to sort of prosecute 4 years later. Okay. Okay, so one thing that these appellate cases have taught us, and there's a lot of them right now. Like I said, I'm involved in 3. There's a lot also pending. There's a few parent side attorneys who are sort of taking this as their platform. To be fair, it's not a very well-written law, which is why they amended it in July, and it still has some work, we think, to do, especially in terms of special ed students, because the special ed students, it doesn't take into account whether or not they can form any kind of intent to know that their conduct is harassing, intimidating, or bullying somebody. We're not allowed to take that into consideration when we're deciding whether or not it's a HIB. We can take it into consideration when we're considering discipline, but it's not something that we're allowed to think about when we're saying, did they call someone a name that a reasonable person would say was done on the basis of them wearing glasses, and it caused that reasonable person to be demeaned. Yeah, that's a HIB. Did the cognitively impaired student mean it? No. They didn't have any idea that that's how it would be taken, but we're not allowed to take that into consideration right now. So that's just one of the examples of how we think the law should further change. Another one that is not very clear and that we're waiting for some of these decisions in the appellate level to come down are the process of the hearing. So what for sure is coming out is that we have to take the hearings a little bit more seriously. We have to present evidence to board members. They have to see the investigation reports. They have to see the witness statements. If there's video, the board members need to see the video so that they can consider all of the same evidence that the anti-bullying coordinators considered, that the superintendent considered. They have to see all of that information. And that's not something typically that boards have been doing because it's not clear in the law that you have to. The way that we report out our appeal decisions as a board is also not defined in the law. And it's looking like it's going to be required to be a little bit more formal as well. More than just right now, most boards send out a one-sentence letter that says, we've denied your appeal. And it looks like we're going to have to give them a little bit more information about why we've denied their appeal. The reason for that is because after a parent appeals to the board, they are allowed to then appeal to the Commissioner of Education, which is heard by an administrative law judge in a courtroom. If that judge doesn't know the basis for the board's decision, if the parent doesn't know the basis for the board's decision, it's almost impossible for them to have a hearing on it. And the law does contemplate their right to have a full hearing in front of a judge. So that's why it's looking like our opinions after appeals also have to change. Okay, so then after the board's decision, they have 90 days to appeal that, like I said, to the commissioner. Parents can also appeal or by filing a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. You can also file a complaint in civil court. It's America. We can sue anybody anywhere.
Curiosity, how does the appeal process work if the administration uses their discretion, does a very
that's a good
limited
question.
investigation and says it's not,
Yeah.
and then the parents and the victim want to appeal?
That's a great question. It's the same process. So if the administration decides they're not going to investigate it as a HIB, they have to inform the parent, we're not going to investigate this as a HIB, but we did investigate it as a conflict under a code of conduct. The parent has 60 days to appeal the decision to not investigate it as a HIB. They are allowed to appeal that decision to the board. And the board would then decide, should this have been investigated as a HIB, or are we going to stand by the original decision that it was investigated as a conflict only? And then
Limited investigation that was done.
correct, yes. And then if the board decides, look, we think we should investigate it as a HIB, then the timeline begins, the 10-day reporting or investigation timeline begins from there. That's how it picks back up. Yeah, that's a good question, Steve. Okay, so, good, we're almost done. Sorry, I am over what I said I would be, but, so just one case I wanted to show you guys as an example of conflict And this is basically the one I already told you about. But this is the citation if you ever want to look it up. It's the Board of Ed in Hamilton. It was the conflict between the former friends, kept out of a group, wasn't based on distinguishing characteristics, and this is what the court said. Basically, it was a breakdown of a personal relationship. It wasn't based on a distinguishing characteristic. And this case from 2.5 years ago has really moved forward a lot of the changes in the law with respect to what's a conflict and a HIB because of this case. It helped to inform us as we move forward about HIBs. Okay, does anybody have any questions? Go ahead.
In the beginning of this presentation, you said that a HIB can happen at any school function.
Yes.
Most of this is all between, let's say, two students in our school district.
Yes.
What if it's someone out of district? How is that handled, or is it not?
Can you give me an example? You mean like a sporting team between two towns?
I mean, yeah.
Okay, so.
Football players, whatever.
Sure.
One and the
So let's say it's Lodi and Brook are at a football game and there's some type of interaction in the stands even between the fans from Lodi and Saddlebrook. You could investigate them separately in your own buildings, in your own districts, but only so far as they substantially interfere with the orderly operation within your building. If it doesn't, but you still have evidence that these kids were acting like jerks, you can still pursue them under a code of conduct for that conduct at a board-sponsored event. But it wouldn't be a HIB unless it somehow bled into the school day once they returned to school. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I'm sorry for going over, and I appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you.
Good job, sir.
Go ahead. So I did give my administrative team permission to be excused. I know you have like probably HIB investigations to go work on or something, right?
Okay, that's all. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you, Jessica. This is very helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, it'll take a while.
Okay. Am I on? I am. Okay. Okay, back. Thank you very much. It was very informative. Next, we have, agenda items for board discussion. So let's go to our regular agenda. Okay, on page 2 of the regular agenda where it says board action items, B8 and B9, we will be discussing these in closed, well, not B8, but B9. That's what we're doing later on in closed sessions. Okay? Under education and curriculum, does anyone have any questions for this section? That would be E14 and 15. Question? Okay, go ahead.
7 and 8, the student that discussed last month,
Yes,
I thought we wanted to.
I don't believe we are. The originating district is absorbing that cost. Right?
The state could be paying for this one, but you might be mentioning another one. I don't know. We could talk about it in closed session.
Talk about it in closed, okay? Okay. Okay, finance, budget, facilities, Ray's going to give his report now. Good.
Okay, I'll just highlight some items from here, but before that, as Mrs. Shanley said, regarding the budget question that was approved, I got word from the county office. I have 15 days to modify the 18-19 budget, and then a new tax levy will be struck with the program that I give to the tax collector and the township. That's all for the 2018-19 school year, so the projects must be completed during this school year. They all should be completed except for the security vestibules, which will be, the bids will go out, we'll award a company prior to June, and then the work will just get done in the summer because you can't do that type of work in the buildings during the school day. But all the projects will be completed, if not by June, through the summer. On the agenda for Wednesday, just to highlight a couple items. For the checks, you received one bill list is on your Google Drive. We're going to be processing another dozen or so checks by tomorrow, so you have a small second bill list. The reports for September. F43 is a decrease we had in the original contract awarded to the contractor for the small group instruction room renovations at Franklin School. F44 is, we had to revise the dual-use application that was sent in back in June, July to the county office for room 11 at Smith School. So we have a new county business administrator, and he wants a new application and diagram, so that's in your packet. F45 is budget parameters and budget calendar. It's a rough calendar, dates similar to we've had in the past, and also the guiding parameters, talks about taxes and staffing levels, just a general guideline for the budget committee to follow. I'll be reviewing the budget with Mrs. Shanley in the next week or so, and then the information is going to be going out to the administrators to start building the budget for 1920. We had some donations there as listed, the amendment to the ESEA grant for 1819, another parent contract for another student, and the last item was when closing up the books during the audit, which is going on currently. This was an additional action from, I think it was either September, October, when you saw $193,000 being transferred from surplus. This is another $24,304 to complete that. So any questions on any finance, budget, facility items?
No? We're good? Okay. All right, for policy, are there any questions or comments or discussion on those policies that were attached? Anything? Okay. Okay, is there anything, negotiations? Nothing? Okay. Okay, and, go ahead.
We do have, we're working on a meeting date, correct?
It looks like it's going to be February 6th.
February 6th for negotiations.
Okay, February 6th for negotiations. Okay. And personnel, we'll go discuss.
Well, we'll discuss in closed.
Closed, right? Okay.
Personnel, yeah, if there's any
Personnel, any questions? We'll discuss in close and, okay. Anybody have anything? We'll do that. Okay. So getting back to the rest of the agenda, where are we? Going back. All right. Are there any other committee reports? Everybody's quiet today. Okay. No correspondence, Ray?
No.
Any old business? Any new business? Okay, so if everybody's good, I'd like a motion to open the meeting to the public.
Second.
All in favor? Any opposed? Okay, the meeting is now open to the public. Residents are requested to state their names, addresses, and subject matter. I'm not going to read the whole thing if nobody gets up, but if someone's getting up, I'll read everything. So long. Does anybody from the public wish to be heard? No? Okay, so I'll close the meeting to the public. Can I have a motion? Can I have a second? Okay, can I have a motion to go into closed session? Okay, all in favor? Do you need a roll call for that? No. Okay, all in favor? Any opposed? Okay, we're going to recess to close executive session to discuss personnel, HIB investigations, contract negotiations, and matters covered by the attorney-client privilege as per the Open Public Meeting Act. The subject matter discussed may be disclosed to the public if and when the need for confidentiality no longer exists. Action may be taken when the board reconvenes in open session. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. I don't know how long we'll be.
Although we're not taking action tonight,
Oh, we're not taking action?
right?
No.
No action tonight, okay, so.
No action.
So if not, you go home, and we'll see you on Wednesday. Thank you for coming. Thank you.